Okay, good morning. Or good evening, depending upon where you are. Okay, so the question that we had come through for this week was, there's a reference, it's the Bhagavad Gita, chapter 4, verse 11, and the commentary. The commentary states, God remains neutral towards the method of action. The question is, how do we correlate this with the statement, nature always helps? Okay. So this question is highlighting the distinction between two things, God and nature. So we've got to look at the statement from two perspectives. When we use the word God, it has the connotation of sakshi, or witness. So what do we mean by the word sakshi, witness? The relationship between God and nature is what? When we look at, for example, electricity running through a bulb, what do we have? We've got the filament and the glass and the fitting and everything else, and you have the electricity running through it. You get heat and light coming from the bulb. Different bulbs will have different amounts of heat and light, different colors, all that kind of stuff. But the electricity running through them is the same. The comparison here is that nature refers to the bulb and everything that is contained in the bulb. As I say, filament, glass, vacuum, etc. The bulb cannot glow without the electricity running through it. But if you've got 1,000 different bulbs, you'll have 1,000 different outputs, but the electricity running through them is the same, indistinguishable. So this is the first aspect of the idea of sakshi, is that it enlivens. It's that which gives vitalization to nature. The second is that it is neutral. So now, whether the bulb is bright or dim, whether it's a warm color or a cold color, whether it's blue or green, whether it's 1,000 watts or 10 watts, the electricity running through it is the same. So the expression does not depend upon the electricity. The expression depends upon the quality or the nature of the bulb. The other example that's used in the text Vedanta treatise is that of gasoline and a car. Whether a car's performance is good, or whether a car's performance is powerful or mediocre, depends not upon the gasoline in it, but rather the quality of the engine. Whether the gasoline results in a car driving safely or having an accident isn't responsibility of the gasoline. Again, it's the responsibility of the driver and the vehicle. So, what are we looking at here? God remains neutral towards the method of action. When we look at different individuals and their actions, this person is highly virtuous, unselfish, noble in their actions. This person is neutral, they go about their daily business. And this person is vicious, performing acts of cruelty, causing suffering, and so on and so forth. That's like the expression from the bulb. So what is the bulb? Body, mind, intellect, etc. There is God or self enlivening that. So God is that which enlivens nature and which remains completely neutral towards the expression of it, in the same way that electricity does for a bulb. The other analogy that's often used with the word sakshi is that of the sun. Life on earth cannot exist without the sun. Plant, animal, human, all of life and all of the activity depends upon the sun. But the sun does not depend upon us. If the earth were to crumble out of existence, the sun would remain. So it enlivens all of our activity. The sun shines equally on the vicious and the virtuous. It's neutral towards the kind of activity that we carry out. Nature, what does nature refer to? Nature refers to the manifested cosmos, and we can think of it as, or from the perspective of both the microcosm and the macrocosm. Microcosm means the individual. Any one person can carry out a whole range of activities and actions. Your body, mind, and intellect chooses your actions. You can also think of nature as from the macrocosmic perspective, which is the totality of all aspects of nature. So that, as I say, is the manifested cosmos and its movement. So nature is not neutral. There is a pervading intelligence in nature. And you watch nature documentaries, or you spend time in the natural world, and you begin to sense this, that there is an intelligence that brings everything together in a natural harmony. What we mean by saying it's not neutral is that nature reacts to the environment. Now, nature is the environment, but what I mean is nature reacts to environmental cues. And those reactions have a direction of response. If you look at, for example, climate, right? Part of the idea of climate damage that we are facing at the moment is that we are making changes to our environment and nature is responding as a result. There are two great videos out there. There's more than two but that I specifically am familiar with. One is called How Whales Change Climate, and the other is called How Wolves Change Rivers. And it's basically talking about what's known as trophic cascades. So the idea is, for example, that a whale eats its food and then it excretes these big plumes of whale dung. I'm not sure what the official word for whale poo is. That then has a trophic cascade. It becomes food for other creatures. Those creatures do their activities and so on and so forth. And you get ultimately this idea that whales can help absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, thereby changing climate. Okay, the idea is that there is a cascade of effects from one thing to the next, and that's just whales. Everything's interlinked. So nature reacts to the cues that we put in, and it reacts in a specific direction, so it's not neutral. And the example that we always use when we're getting our heads around this is to say, what happens when you cut your finger? Okay, immediately nature reacts. There's nothing you can do to start it. There's nothing you can do to stop it. It heals. So nature moves towards a rebalancing to bring things back into a stable equilibrium. That doesn't mean static. It's a dynamic equilibrium, but a stable equilibrium. Nature's always moving towards growth. And of course, we see that in the plant world and the animal world. We see that within the human personality, psychologically. The psyche the psychology of a human being when it's faced with challenges is to try and reconfigure its understanding of the world so that it can accommodate those challenges and overcome them. We're always making meaning out of the world. And with that meaning, we try and negotiate our way through it towards our own well-being. So there is an urge for psychological complexity or sophistication, natural within us. So when we say this phrase, nature always helps, what are we saying? That there is a direction to nature's reaction and response. And that direction is towards a rebalancing, a healing, stability, growth. There are all these kinds of ideas. So associated with this idea of nature always helps is a surrender to the plan of nature. This is another phrase that is often used in the Vedantic literature. So what does that mean? Surrendering to the plan of nature means that we reflect upon and begin to feel this truth, that nature has this underlying intelligence and that it's moving towards growth, rebalancing, and healing. In a sense, that nature knows what it's doing. You can trust it. And so helps now is understood in this way, that nature is responding to the cues that we are putting into it. So what it means is that we can view both success and adversity through this lens. Surrendering to the plan of nature means that we don't personalize our response to it. It means that we don't resist it. And instead of saying, my will should be done, what I want, we say, thy will be done. Now, to whom are we referring when we say thy? We're referring to this totality of nature and its underlying intelligence, its movement. Okay, so the phrase thy will be done obviously comes from the Lord's Prayer. There it's directed towards God. But even in that context, it's directed towards a personal God, which would be part of nature. God doesn't have a form, doesn't have ears to listen. So when we view specifically adversity through this lens of surrendering to the plan of nature, nature always helps, we begin to see it from a different perspective, that nature is bringing things into our field of experience that are a natural consequence of the causes that we have been putting in to the world and into ourselves. What's my vision? What's my level of vibration, to use that phrase, my emotional profile, the thoughts that I entertain? What am I preparing myself for? And as nature moves things out of our field of experience, we can think of it from the perspective of, now it's time for those things to be moved out. Nature knows what it's doing. So it's surrendering those areas where we recognize we don't have control. Some things come into my field of experience, some things move out without my control. Rather than resisting what is rather arbitrarily described by me as adversity, and rather than trying to cling on to things that I say that I like, I allow this flow, this movement of nature. So it's a stepping back and seeing this constant movement going on and going with it. There's a really nice image in one of the Game of Thrones books, and he says, a man agrees with God as a droplet agrees with the storm. What is he saying there? So the word God in that context is referring to what we're talking about, nature here, which is that there's a flow going on and we're in it, and we can't disagree with it because we're in that flow of nature. We're part of it. When you gain that vision, there is a diminishing of that resistance. Now, that doesn't mean that you relinquish your choices. You can take the idea of surrender too far so that something which is positive, healthy, productive for your growth becomes the opposite of that. So the idea of surrendering to the plan of nature must be balanced with autonomy, with being self-directed, with making choices. And of course, that idea of autonomy, of being self-directed, of making choices, that is healthy, positive, productive to your growth. That also can be taken too far. So these are, if you like, complementary opposites: surrender and autonomy, surrender and choice. But here the focus is on the idea of surrender. The analogy, or rather the story that we've used in the past to help illustrate this, is that of the prince who goes on a hunt. So, backstory goes that in the royal court there was a counsellor who had a habit of saying to every circumstance, it's all by the grace of God. It's all by the grace of God. Prince was skeptical of this guy. He seemed like he just talked too much, all that spiritual stuff. Anyway, the prince goes out on to a hunt one day. In the course of hunting, he has an accident and loses his big toe. Now, of course, it's physically painful, psychologically upsetting. Makes his way back to the palace, explains his accident, and of course the counsellor says, this is all by the grace of God, The prince flies into a rage, throws him in the dungeon. The counsellor sits down and says, well, this is all by the grace of God. You. Okay, time passes. Prince goes out on a second hunt. During the second hunt, he is captured by a local tribe, and he's going to be sacrificed to their god. The chief of the tribe comes out, sees the offerings, and looks at this one fellow and says, hang on, this one doesn't have a big toe. Well, you want to give rotten fruit to gods? You can't sacrifice him. There, cut him loose. And so he's cut loose, runs back to the palace, opens the dungeon, falls at the feet of the council and says, I understand, it's all by the grace of God. So what we call adversity is only called adversity from the perspective of our limited ego. There's a movement going on that we cannot see. And if we begin to develop this sense of trust, this surrendering, then we see things differently, less personalized. And it's from that perspective that we can make choices that are based more on a calm mind rather than an ego-centered grasping, demanding that my will be done. So there's another related, very similar sort of story. So this is the description of it coming from a film called Charlie Wilson's War. And towards the very end of the film, one of the characters describes this. He says there was a little boy, and on his 14th birthday, he gets a horse. And everybody in the village says, how wonderful, the boy got a horse. And the Zen master says, we'll see. 2 years later, the boy falls off the horse, breaks his leg, and everybody in the village says, "How terrible." Then the Zen master says, "We'll see." Then a war breaks out, and all the young men have to go off and fight, except the boy can't because his leg's all messed up. And everybody in the village says, "How wonderful." And the Zen master says, "We'll see." So what's this saying? It's not a callous disregard of people's experiences. Instead, what it's saying is that what we call success and adversity is generally based on what I want to be the case, my preferences. This is indicating a different thing. There's a recognition of just a natural flow of events, and you can't inherently call them good and bad because you don't know what any one event will lead to next. When we say something is terrible or wonderful, it's because we've arbitrarily drawn a boundary around certain experiences, certain events, not realizing that those events themselves lead to something next. If we had a larger vision, we'd draw our boundary of consideration around larger number of events, and we look at it differently. And if we drew it around everything that is affected, then is it good or is it bad? Well, it's just nature flowing. God remains neutral towards the method of action. How do we correlate this with the statement, nature always helps? Nature is that which has quality, property, form, and function, and change. The movement of nature is towards that rebalancing, that healing, that growth. What enables nature to do that is the unseen enlivening factor, which we call God. In the context here of this particular verse, the method of action is referring to an individual's choice. God enlivens me to perform a vicious action. God enlivens me to perform a virtuous action. Neutral. Any clarifications to anything there?
When just a little bit on the clarification you mentioned, so surrender in this aspect, looked at it like devotion. If I could put a synonym to it, and you said it doesn't mean relinquish the choice. So trying to put it into terms, it's like mind and intellect helping one another. Can we look at it like that?
Yeah, when you have mind and intellect flowing in confluence, then that's what you do get when you have mature, healthy intellect, mature, healthy mind flowing. What you have is that recognition of cause effect, receipt, reaction, response. That's the intellect. As a consequence, you make a choice. And when you have the mind flowing as well, you have that feeling of surrender. So it means that you make the choices that you recognize are yours to make. This is my obligation. This is who and what I am in this circumstance. These are my goals and my ideals. So I make this choice. It's also a recognition that I have choice of action. I do not have choice of outcome. And so you surrender the outcome. And so if your choices end up in not allowing, or rather, if your choices don't end up in the output that you were aiming towards, that surrender protects you from feeling overly affected, crushed. You don't catastrophize. You recognize, well, I put my efforts in, I did the best that I thought I could, didn't result in what I was aiming at. Again, it doesn't mean that you say, well, then maybe this is not for me. You might say, let's do it again. What didn't I do right the first time? How do I learn from this? But you can't have that attitude while you're worried and anxious and bemoaning the fact that you didn't get what you were looking for. So that surrender really protects us from that personalization of experiences, whether it's success or failure. Any other clarifications?
Hi, Glenn.
Good morning.
Nice to see you.
Yeah, you too.
I'm sorry I came late, but if you are lacking further questions, I have a question on a completely different topic.
Yeah, sure. I'll just offer a last moment if there's any clarifications on this question. Oh, it looks like not. Yeah, so go ahead.
So my question is on illusion and intrinsic and extrinsic illusion. And I thought I understood it, but it seems like I'm not exactly understanding it. So let me tell you what I do understand, and then you can clarify. So intrinsic illusion is non-apprehension, meaning that you see something and you don't see it exactly as it is, you see something else. You see a post, or there's a post, but instead of the post, you see a ghost. Extrinsic is the misapprehension. And misapprehension is where you see it's the rope snake example. But I'm trying to understand the difference between the snake and rope example and the post and the ghost example. It seems to me that they're the same. Is it that in the illusion, the first step of the illusion is the non-apprehension? You see something, you don't know what it is, you state it as something else that appears to you initially. And then is it a misapprehension that you try to use your reasoning? It looks like this, therefore it is that. If you can clarify, I'd appreciate it.
Okay, so non-apprehension doesn't refer to either of the illusions. Non-apprehension refers to the fact that you're not seeing a thing as it is. The illusions refer to the stage after that, which is misapprehension. Okay, so let's use the rope snake example to try and flesh this out. We all know the rope snake example. There is a rope on the ground at twilight. A young boy is walking through the yard and doesn't see the rope as a rope. That's non-apprehension. Now, of course, in the actual experience of this, there's no distinction between the two. It's all happening seemingly as a single event. We're pulling it apart for analytical purposes. But the first aspect of what the boy experiences is non-apprehension. What follows the non-apprehension, which is not seeing the rope as the thing that it is to see the rope as something else. That's misapprehension. And that's where he sees the snake. So what have we got here? We've got, first of all, an intrinsic illusion. As you stated, the intrinsic illusion is where you see the image and you don't see the object. So in this instance, obviously the image is the snake, the object is the rope. Now, the moment the boy's father turns the light on, the outside light comes on, the snake is bathed in light and it immediately disappears and you see the rope. So that's what makes it the intrinsic illusion. You only see one and not the other. When the boy sees the snake, he does not see the rope. When he sees the rope, he does not see the snake. There's no coexistence of the two. So the seeing of the snake is not non-apprehension. Non-apprehension is the stage that precedes seeing the rope. Non-apprehension is the stage that precedes seeing the snake.
Okay.
Seeing the snake is a misapprehension. In fact, what I'd say is, for the moment, leave non-apprehension, misapprehension just to the side. The intrinsic illusion, you see the object and not the snake, or you see the snake and not the rope. That's what makes it intrinsic. You only see one. The extrinsic illusion, if you like, follows on from the intrinsic. So in an extrinsic illusion, there are three things coexisting. You have the object, you have the image, and you have the medium in which the image arises. So let's go to another example to illustrate this. When you see yourself in a mirror, you there have an extrinsic illusion. Why? What do you have? Appearing altogether is the image, which is the reflection that you see. And if it's one of those crazy mirrors, you're elongated or you're short and squat. So you see the image, that's one thing that is there. You see the object, which is your own physical body. And you have the mirror, which allows for the image to show up. Again, fairly trivial to understand. Now we take the two descriptions and bring them together. When you have the boy seeing the snake, that snake, the illusory snake, the image that he has, that now becomes the medium. So the thought, the perception of the snake is a medium. It's like the mirror. Now, it's a medium for what? Okay, you have the properties of the rope. What's the rope like? What are its properties? Okay, it's 6 feet long, 4 inches thick, and it's brown. Those are the properties of the rope. The boy runs inside, says to his father, "There's a snake outside." Dad says, "Here we go again. Describe the snake for me." He says, "Well, it's got to be around 6 feet long, probably 4 inches thick. Okay, it's a decent sized snake, and it's brown." So what's the boy seeing? The boy is seeing the properties of the snake. So the properties of the snake is the image, the illusory snake that he's set up in his mind is the medium that allows that image to be projected, and it's the properties of the rope that are reflected in that illusory snake.
Can you repeat that statement one more time, please?
Mm-hmm. So the properties of the snake is the extrinsic image. The illusory snake that he set up in his mind is the medium, which allows that image to show up. And the properties of the rope are what is reflected in that medium. So think of it this way. It's not possible that the boy sees a green snake. Why not? Because the rope is brown. It's not possible that the boy sees a snake that is 2 feet long and half an inch thick. Why not? Because the properties of the rope actually exist. They actually exist as 6'4" black brown. They are reflected in the illusory snake to give rise to the properties of the snake. 6'4" brown. So that reflection of the actually existing properties of the rope can only happen when the boy has, there is a snake.
So is it that I'm still having a tough time with this? I understand it at one level, but then is it that the medium is really in your mind? Is your thought? Because I hear it saying that the medium is what the projection is, that becomes the medium through which the properties of the reflection is seen. But since that is a creation or a projection in your mind, is that where the medium really resides?
Yeah, so in the example that we're given, the medium is in the boy's mind. That's where it is. The illusory snake isn't anywhere except in his own thoughts.
So in other words, when we talk about the only way to get beyond Maya and illusion is knowledge, is when your ignorance, when the ignorance of your mind and your thoughts has been removed by flipping on the switch, that's when Maya disappears. Okay.
Yeah, so the illusion disappears when you see the real thing. When you see the real thing, then the whole lot disappears, or the whole illusion disappears. So he talks about this in the Vedanta Treatise. He says, it's to the credit of prevailing religions that they have gone some way to removing the extrinsic illusion. So what does it mean to remove the extrinsic illusion? When, let's say that the boy's father says to him, boy, it's a rope. The boy goes outside, the light's still not on. He actually still sees the snake, but he believes what his father's saying, it's a rope. So he can say, so I'm looking at a rope. Now, in his own mind, he still kind of sees a snake. He doesn't see a rope yet. To him, it still looks like a snake. But he's beginning to recognize there is actually that rope out there, which is 6'4" brown. So what does that look like from a perspective of human growth? When we look at the world, we see the properties of the world. Okay, so let's say we're all caught up in the illusion. I see the properties of the world, and the way that it's described is to say that the world is made up of time, space, and causation, out of the properties. So when we're talking about the properties of the world, we're not talking about, my cup is brown, the sky is blue, the grass is green, friend is pleasant, my enemy is unpleasant. We're not talking about specific aspects of the world. We're talking about the whole thing in total. So you can't say the world is blue. You can't say the world is nice. Individual aspects of the world, we can talk about their properties, but that's not the context here. The context here is the totality of the cosmos. So what is it made up of? What are its properties? Time, space, and causation. So what it's saying is that time, space, and causation are reflections of the properties of reality. Time is eternal, space is all-pervading, causation is infinite. So the eternality, the all-pervasiveness, the infinitude of the cosmos are just reflections of the eternal, all-pervading, infinite nature of reality. So to remove the extrinsic illusion would be to say that I'm not looking at the world. What am I looking at here? Everything is divinity and divinity alone. Every aspect of experience that I have, there's a coherence, there's a cohesiveness, there's a unity, a totality view. And it's actually related to the surrender that we were talking about in the first question. There's a totality view where everything you see, you recognize it, inwardly recognize it, of course, as a movement of consciousness, a movement of divinity, God and God alone. I've given the story of someone who was talking in this way. She was a great devotee of Krishna. And she says, when I see the trees, these are Krishna's lungs. When I see the sky, this is Krishna's mind. When I feel the wind, that's Krishna's breath. This sort of idea that everything is just movement of divinity. And so there has been a removal of boundaries and barriers. So that's you can say the removing of the extrinsic illusion, where you don't see now the properties of the world as a separate thing. You see the properties of the world, actually, what are they? They're the properties of divinity. So everywhere you look is divinity. So the extrinsic illusion is removed in that way. Removing the intrinsic illusion is to remove the belief, I am an individual. Because when I say everything I experience is divinity, there is still this separation. Me and the divinity that I am experiencing. So either you see yourself as an individual or you see yourself as the totality. You can't be both. I exist as this individual body, mind, intellect system. And there's nothing but joy and beauty that I see everywhere I look around me. I see nothing but a movement of consciousness. Who sees it? Well, the individual sees it. There's a perfect harmony with the movement of the cosmos. There's no resistance to anything. There's that sense of being in the flow. But I am an individual droplet in the flow. You can't hold that view and hold the view, I am the totality. So that's removing the intrinsic illusion, one or the other.
Thank you. Thank you. Really helps.
Yeah, any clarifications? Any other questions people would like to bring up?
Yes, when are you coming to San Diego?
Yeah, great question. When are you coming to New Zealand? Yeah, I do keep thinking about it, I must say. San Diego, LA, of course, and India are all on my mind on a daily basis, I have to say. So yeah, unfortunately, I don't have specific plans. In fact, I do have some things that I'm doing here that I can't get away from until that training or those courses have finished. I need to be here in person to finish them off. But yeah, I would love to be back, at least for a small while.
As soon as your training is over, you know, our homes are all open to you.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, I trust all is well in Southern California.
Yes, Aravindanji is actually coming in about 10 days.
Oh, marvelous.
So we're putting an impromptu retreat.
Excellent. Okay. If that's the end of the questions, as always, appreciate the questions, the attendance, and the attention. We're back on Sunday morning Pacific time. We're starting with Bajagolvindam. So for those joining, I'll see you then. And for those not, catch you next time.
Thank you, Glenn.
Hariom.
Thank you.